Sometimes the loudest act of courage is simply showing up when the person you love believes they are completely alone. The laughter began long before anyone noticed the little girl standing perfectly still in the center of Jefferson Elementary School's courtyard. It echoed between the brick walls, bounced beneath the fluttering American flag, and drifted through the crisp October air as students gathered with their phones raised just high enough to capture another moment they believed would disappear by tomorrow. But some moments never disappear. Some moments quietly shape the rest of a person's life. 11-year-old Sophie Carter lowered her eyes toward the faded sneakers she had worn for nearly 2 years. The white canvas had long surrendered to countless rainy walks, and the rubber soles carried the tiny scratches of a childhood her father had worked tirelessly to protect. She clutched her worn backpack tightly against her chest, hoping it might somehow make her invisible. It never did. A few feet away, a group of students whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She wears the same hoodie every week." Another voice laughed. "Maybe her dad forgot what a washing machine is." More giggles followed. One student quietly recorded the scene without saying a word. Others smiled awkwardly, unsure whether to join in or walk away. Even those who never spoke found themselves trapped inside the silence that bullying always creates. Sophie swallowed hard, but she refused to cry. Her father had once told her that tears were never something to be ashamed of. Yet she also remembered another promise they repeated together every single morning before school. "Always choose kindness, no matter what." She whispered those words to herself now, almost too softly to hear. They were not magic. They did not stop the laughter. But they reminded her who she wanted to become. Inside the front office, Principal Linda Harrison stared at the security monitor with growing concern. She watched students gathering instead of walking to class. She noticed one teacher hurrying across the courtyard. Then she saw Sophie standing alone in the middle of the crowd. Her expression changed. Immediately. "Call her father," she said quietly to the school secretary. Right now. Several miles away, Daniel Carter tightened the final bolt beneath an old classroom sink inside Lincoln High School, where he worked as a maintenance technician. His blue work jacket was faded from years of honest labor, and his hands carried the familiar marks of someone who fixed broken things every day without expecting recognition. His phone vibrated across the metal toolbox beside him. He wiped his hands on a clean rag before answering. Daniel Carter speaking. Principal Harrison's voice sounded calm, but beneath her professionalism, he heard unmistakable urgency. "Mr. Carter, I need you to come to Jefferson Elementary as soon as possible." Daniel stood completely still. "Is Sophie hurt?" There was a brief pause. "Physically, no, but I believe she needs her father." Daniel did not ask another question. "I am on my way." He hung up, quietly closed his toolbox, and walked toward the parking lot without rushing. A younger custodian looked up from mopping the hallway. "Everything okay, Daniel?" Daniel offered a small nod that never reached his eyes. "My daughter needs me." That was all he said. Minutes later, his aging pickup truck rolled onto the county highway beneath a sky painted with brilliant shades of autumn gold. Maple leaves drifted across the windshield while sunlight filtered gently through rows of towering oak trees. Inside the cab, there was only the soft hum of the engine and the framed photograph tucked into the corner of the dashboard. It showed Daniel, Sophie, and his late wife Emily smiling beside a lake during happier days. Before starting every morning, Daniel always touched that photograph and quietly repeated the same promise. "I will raise her with kindness, no matter how hard the world becomes." Today those words carried a different weight. Back at Jefferson Elementary, the courtyard slowly grew quieter as whispers replaced laughter. Students began glancing toward the front entrance for reasons they could not explain. The teacher who had reached Sophie gently rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but the little girl never looked up. She simply continued holding her backpack as though it contained every fragile piece of her heart. Then, beyond the glass doors at the front of the school, a familiar figure appeared. He was not wearing an expensive suit. He was not surrounded by authority. He was simply a father in a worn blue work jacket walking with calm, steady steps toward the daughter who believed she had been standing alone. And without speaking a single word, the entire courtyard slowly began to fall silent. Daniel Carter walked across the courtyard without hurrying because he had learned years ago that panic rarely helped a frightened child feel safe. The afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the concrete, and the breeze carried dry maple leaves past rows of students who had suddenly forgotten whatever seemed so funny only moments earlier. Sophie finally looked up when she recognized the familiar rhythm of her father's footsteps. For a second she tried to smile, hoping he would believe everything was fine, but children rarely succeed in hiding pain from the people who love them most. Daniel stopped only a few feet away and met her eyes with the same gentle expression she had known her entire life. "Hey, sunshine," he said softly. "I came as fast as I could." Sophie nodded, but no words came. Daniel never asked difficult questions in front of strangers. Instead, he quietly opened his arms. She stepped forward immediately, burying her face against his worn blue work jacket, while the courtyard remained completely silent. He rested one hand lightly on the back of her head, not trying to shield her from the world, only reminding her that she did not have to face it by herself. Principal Linda Harrison approached with measured steps. "Mr. Carter," she said, "thank you for coming." Daniel gently released Sophie, but kept one reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Can someone tell me what happened?" His voice was calm, respectful, and completely free of anger. Several teachers exchanged uncertain glances before one of them answered. There was an incident during lunch recess. A group of students began making comments about Sophie's clothes and her family. More students gathered, and someone started recording with a phone. Daniel listened without interrupting. When the teacher finished speaking, he simply nodded once. "Has everyone involved been identified?" Principal Harrison answered honestly. "Not yet. We are reviewing everything now." Daniel looked around the courtyard. Many students lowered their eyes as soon as they realized he was not there to argue or embarrass anyone. They had expected shouting. Instead, they found quiet dignity, and somehow that felt much heavier. Sophie gently tugged on her father's sleeve. "Dad," she whispered, "can we just go home?" Daniel knelt until they were eye level. "We will go home when you are ready. But first I want you to know something." She blinked through tears she had tried so hard to hide. "What?" He smiled with the warmth only a father could give. "Nothing anyone says about your clothes can ever change who you are. Nothing anyone laughs about can ever take away your kindness. I am proud of you today, just like I was yesterday." Sophie looked down for a moment before quietly asking, "Even if everybody laughed?" Daniel gently lifted her chin. "Especially today." Those words settled over the courtyard more powerfully than any raised voice could have. A few students shifted uncomfortably while others glanced toward the phones still resting in their hands. One boy slowly lowered his device until it disappeared into his backpack. The teacher standing nearby quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. She had expected confrontation. Instead, she was watching a lesson far more meaningful than anything written inside a textbook. Principal Harrison cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, would you be willing to join us in my office? We have security cameras covering most of the courtyard, and I believe it is important that we understand exactly what happened." Daniel nodded politely. "Of course." Before they turned toward the school building, he looked back at the students one last time. He did not glare. He did not accuse. He simply offered a small, tired smile that carried years of hard work, quiet sacrifice, and unconditional love. It was the smile of a father who believed children could still learn to become better people if someone chose grace before judgment. As Daniel and Sophie walked side by side through the front doors of Jefferson Elementary, the courtyard remained unusually still. Conversations faded. Phones stayed in pockets. Even the autumn wind seemed quieter than before. Somewhere inside the building, security cameras held the truth of everything that had happened. But long before any video began to play, another truth had already become impossible to ignore. The strongest person on campus was not the loudest voice in the crowd. It was the father who chose compassion when the world expected anger. Principal Linda Harrison quietly closed the office door, leaving the noise of the school hallway behind. The room felt unusually still as afternoon sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long golden lines across the polished wooden table. Daniel Carter sat beside Sophie instead of across from her, allowing their shoulders to touch just enough to remind her she was not facing this alone. Sophie kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She looked more worried about disappointing her father than about anything that had happened outside. Daniel noticed immediately. He gently placed his weathered hand over hers. "You do not have to carry this by yourself anymore," he said softly. Sophie finally looked at him. "I did not want to make your life harder." Daniel smiled with quiet warmth. Sweetheart, being your father is never the hard part. Not knowing you were hurting is. Those simple words settled over the room with a silence that no one wanted to interrupt. Principal Harrison slowly opened a folder containing attendance reports, teacher notes, and several written statements collected over the previous hour. Mr. Carter, she began carefully. After speaking with Sophie's teachers, I am beginning to believe today's incident was not isolated. Daniel remained calm. How long has this been happening? The principal lowered her eyes before answering. It appears several months. Daniel did not react with anger. He simply took a slow breath and nodded once, though the disappointment behind his eyes was impossible to hide. Sophie quietly whispered, I thought it would stop if I ignored it. Daniel turned toward her. Why did you not tell me? She hesitated for several seconds before answering. Because you already work so much. I know you leave before sunrise. I know you come home tired. I did not want you to worry about me too. Daniel looked away for a brief moment as emotion quietly filled the room. Every extra shift he had accepted, every weekend spent repairing broken pipes or fixing classroom doors, had always been for her. Yet while he was trying to build a better future, she had been protecting him from a pain no child should ever carry alone. He gently reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded photograph that had softened around the edges from years of being carried everywhere. It showed Emily standing between Daniel and a much younger Sophie beside a peaceful lake under a bright summer sky. Daniel smiled faintly. Do you remember what your mom used to tell us every Sunday morning? Sophie nodded almost immediately. A family tells each other the truth because love is never afraid of honesty. Daniel nodded. Exactly. He carefully placed the photograph into Sophie's hands. Your mom and I promised each other that no burden inside this family would ever belong to just one person. We carry them together. Sophie's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. She leaned against her father's shoulder as he quietly wrapped one arm around her. Across the table, Principal Harrison looked down at her own notes, realizing that what she was witnessing had little to do with school discipline and everything to do with the quiet strength of a family refusing to let hardship define them. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. The assistant principal stepped inside, carrying a tablet computer. We have gathered security footage from the courtyard, he said. There is also another recording that was anonymously submitted by a student. Daniel looked toward him. Anonymous. The assistant principal nodded. One student recorded everything, but instead of posting it online, they sent it directly to the school office after seeing how upset Sophie was. Principal Harrison accepted the tablet and looked at the screen for only a few moments before her expression changed completely. She slowly removed her glasses and exhaled. This tells a very different story than the rumors we heard earlier. Daniel did not ask what the video showed. He simply looked at Sophie and gently squeezed her hand. The truth has a way of finding its voice, he whispered. Outside the office window, students quietly changed classes beneath bright autumn skies, unaware that a single decision made by one child to choose honesty over popularity was about to change far more than anyone inside Jefferson Elementary could possibly imagine. In that quiet office, surrounded by ordinary furniture and fading afternoon sunlight, the first pieces of the real story were finally beginning to come together, and before the school day ended, every assumption made about Sophie would be tested against the one thing no crowd could ever outrun: the truth. Principal Linda Harrison slowly placed the tablet on the conference table without saying a word. The room remained completely still except for the quiet ticking of the clock above the office door. Daniel Carter noticed the change in her expression long before she spoke. It was no longer the face of someone trying to understand a difficult situation. It was the face of someone realizing the truth had been there all along, hidden beneath assumptions and silence. She looked toward the assistant principal. Please bring in Mrs. Foster and the students identified in the video. Within a few minutes, the classroom teacher entered alongside 4 students who had been standing in the courtyard earlier that afternoon. None of them looked at Sophie. Their confidence from lunchtime had quietly disappeared. Daniel remained seated beside his daughter, gently holding her hand beneath the table. He offered no angry stare and no harsh words. His calm presence filled the room more completely than any argument ever could. Principal Harrison pressed play. The security footage appeared first, showing students gathering around Sophie while she stood alone near a bench. The camera had no sound, but but it clearly showed her taking several small steps backward as the circle around her slowly grew larger. Then the anonymous phone recording began. Unlike the security camera, this video captured every word. A few students laughed about Sophie's faded hoodie. Someone joked about her old backpack. Another voice mocked the pickup truck her father drove every morning. Through it all, Sophie never insulted anyone in return. She simply hugged her books closer and quietly said, "Please stop." The room fell silent as the recording continued. Daniel never looked away from the screen, but his grip around Sophie's hand became just a little firmer. The final seconds of the video showed something that surprised everyone. Before the teacher arrived, one student stepped out of the crowd and quietly told the others to leave Sophie alone. The crowd ignored that plea, but the moment had been recorded forever. Principal Harrison paused the video and folded her hands. "Thank you," she said softly to the assistant principal. She turned toward the students seated across the table. "Would any of you like to tell me something different from what we just watched?" No one answered. One boy stared at the floor, while another slowly wiped tears from his eyes. Finally, a girl who had laughed the loudest spoke in a trembling voice. "We thought everybody else was doing it. We never thought." Her words faded away before she could finish. Daniel quietly looked toward her. His voice remained gentle. "Do you know what my daughter did every morning before coming to school?" The students slowly shook their heads. Daniel smiled sadly. She reminded herself to choose kindness. Even today, after everything that happened, she never said one cruel word about any of you. The room became even quieter. Mrs. Foster lowered her eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I should have noticed sooner." Sophie was becoming quieter every week. "I thought she was simply shy. I am deeply sorry." Daniel nodded respectfully. "Thank you for saying that." He did not ask for blame. He did not demand punishment. Instead, he looked toward Principal Harrison. "What matters most to me is making sure no child believes they have to carry this alone again." Principal Harrison took a slow breath. Before standing, "You have my word. This school will do better." She looked toward the students. "There will be appropriate consequences, but consequences alone do not create better people. Understanding does." She then turned back toward Daniel and Sophie. "Tomorrow morning, I will meet with every teacher, every staff member, and every student leader. We are going to change how this school responds when one child is left standing alone." Sophie quietly looked at her father. "Dad," she whispered, "are they really listening now?" Daniel smiled with the same warmth that had comforted her since she was a little girl. Sometimes people hear the truth only after the noise finally stops. Outside the office windows, the last golden light of the afternoon settled across the playground where children had already gone home. The empty swings moved gently in the autumn breeze, and Jefferson Elementary seemed quieter than it had in years. Inside that small office, no voices were raised, no harsh words were spoken, and no one left feeling victorious over someone else. Instead, the truth had quietly entered the room, and once it did, every excuse, every rumor, and every careless laugh slowly disappeared into a silence that every person present would remember for the rest of their lives. The next morning, Jefferson Elementary felt different before the first bell ever rang. The familiar sounds of children laughing and teachers greeting students were still there, but something quieter had settled over the campus. Word had spread about the meeting in the principal's office, though very few people knew exactly what had been said. They only knew that the truth had replaced the rumors, and somehow that alone had changed the atmosphere. Daniel Carter parked his aging pickup truck in the same visitor space he had used the day before. As always, he stepped out first, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door for Sophie. She hesitated before climbing down. Her eyes drifted toward the school entrance where dozens of students were arriving. Daniel noticed the uncertainty on her face and smiled gently. "You do not have to be brave by yourself," he said. Sophie looked up at him. What if everybody is staring again? Daniel carefully adjusted the strap of her faded backpack before answering. "Then let them see someone who chose kindness even when it was difficult." Sophie took a slow breath and nodded. Together they walked toward the front entrance beneath rows of maple trees glowing with brilliant shades of orange and gold. Principal Linda Harrison was already waiting outside. Instead of greeting students from the doorway as she normally did, she stepped forward to meet Daniel and Sophie personally. "Good morning," she said warmly. "We are glad you are here." Sophie managed a small smile. Good morning. Inside the building, every classroom began the day with something different. Instead of opening math books or spelling lists, teachers shared a simple conversation about respect, empathy, and the responsibility every student carried when they witnessed someone being treated unfairly. No names were mentioned. No child was singled out. The lesson belonged to everyone because kindness belonged to everyone. Mrs. Foster stood before her fifth-grade class holding a single sheet of paper. Today, she said softly, we are going to remember that every person sitting in this room has a story we cannot see. The classroom remained unusually quiet. Several students glanced toward Sophie before quickly looking away again. During the morning recess, something unexpected happened. The same courtyard that had echoed with laughter the previous afternoon now filled with hesitant conversations instead. The four students from the principal's office slowly approached Sophie together. Daniel had already returned to work across town, trusting that his daughter deserved the opportunity to walk forward on her own while knowing he was never far away. The girl who had spoken through tears the day before stopped a few feet from Sophie and took a deep breath. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. What we did was wrong. I followed everyone else because I wanted them to like me. That does not make it right. Another student stepped forward. I laughed even though I knew I should not have. One by one, each child admitted their part without excuses. Sophie listened carefully, remembering the promise she and her father repeated every morning. Always choose kindness. She looked at each of them before answering. Thank you for telling the truth. I hope we can all do better. There was no applause, no dramatic celebration, only a gentle silence followed by small smiles that felt honest for the first time. Across the courtyard, Principal Harrison watched from her office window. Beside her stood Mrs. Foster, who quietly wiped away another tear. Children are remarkable, the teacher whispered. They are, the principal replied, especially when adults finally give them the chance to choose what is right. That afternoon, before students boarded their buses, Principal Harrison announced a new Student Kindness Council, peer support groups, and expanded anti-bullying initiatives that every classroom would help shape together. The changes were practical, thoughtful, and lasting because she wanted Jefferson Elementary to become known not for one painful afternoon, but for the way an entire community learned from it. As the final bell echoed through the hallways, Sophie walked toward the parking lot carrying the same faded backpack and wearing the same worn sneakers. Nothing about her appearance had changed, yet everything about the way she carried herself had. She no longer lowered her eyes. She no longer tried to disappear. She simply walked forward with quiet confidence, knowing that dignity had never come from new clothes or popular opinions. It had always been waiting inside her heart, patiently strengthened by the steady love of a father who had taught her that kindness is never weakness and that truth, when spoken with grace, has the remarkable power to change far more than a single day. Several months passed, and winter slowly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring in Jefferson County. Fresh green leaves began replacing the last traces of autumn, and the maple trees lining the streets outside Jefferson Elementary stood quietly beneath bright blue skies. Life had returned to its familiar rhythm, yet something inside the school had changed in ways that could not be measured by report cards or attendance records. Every classroom now began Monday mornings with a few minutes dedicated to kindness, respect, and listening. Students learned that courage was not only standing up for yourself. Sometimes courage meant standing beside someone everyone else had overlooked. Sophie Carter noticed the difference in small moments before she noticed it in the larger ones. A classmate held the cafeteria door open without being asked. Another student invited someone sitting alone to join a lunch table. The Kindness Council, organized by Principal Linda Harrison, had become one of the most popular student groups in the school, proving that compassion could spread just as quickly as cruelty once people chose to practice it. Daniel Carter never expected anyone to remember the quiet afternoon he walked across the school courtyard wearing his faded blue work jacket. He continued repairing classrooms at Lincoln High School, arriving before sunrise and leaving after the final maintenance checklist had been completed. Every morning, he still drove Sophie to school in the same aging pickup truck. Every morning before she stepped out, they repeated the same promise together: always choose kindness. It had become more than a family tradition. It had become the foundation of the life they were building together. One Friday afternoon, Principal Harrison invited parents and students to the school's annual Community Appreciation Assembly. Daniel almost declined because he had promised to repair a broken heating unit before the weekend. But Sophie smiled and quietly said, "I would really like you to come." He never needed another reason. The school gymnasium filled with families, teachers, and students as sunlight poured through the high windows onto rows of folding chairs. The atmosphere felt warm, peaceful, and hopeful. Principal Harrison stepped onto the stage and looked across the audience before speaking. "This year we learned an important lesson," she began. "Schools are not judged only by academic success. They are also measured by how well they protect the dignity of every child who walks through their doors." The audience listened in complete silence. She continued, "Several months ago, one family reminded all of us what quiet strength truly looks like. A father chose compassion instead of anger. A daughter chose kindness instead of bitterness. Their example changed this school more than they may ever realize." Daniel immediately lowered his eyes, hoping no one would look toward him. He had never wanted recognition. He had only wanted his daughter to feel safe again. Principal Harrison smiled gently. "Mr. Carter, Sophie, would you please join me for a moment?" The gymnasium remained completely still as father and daughter slowly walked toward the stage together. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable beneath hundreds of eyes, while Sophie quietly slipped her hand into his. Principal Harrison handed Sophie a small framed certificate recognizing her courage, empathy, and resilience. Then she turned toward Daniel. "There is no award large enough for teaching a child that dignity is stronger than anger," she said softly. "But our entire community would like to say thank you." No loud music played. No dramatic spotlight appeared. Instead, every person inside the gymnasium slowly rose to their feet. Teachers stood first, then parents, then students. Even the children who had once laughed at Sophie stood with sincere respect. The applause remained gentle rather than overwhelming, carrying gratitude instead of excitement. Daniel looked around the room before quietly kneeling beside Sophie. "This applause is not for us," he whispered. "It is for every person who decided to become kinder." Sophie smiled through grateful tears. "Mom would have liked today." Daniel looked toward the sunlight shining through the gymnasium windows and smiled softly. "I think she already knows." As they walked out of the school together that afternoon, the spring breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the playground, where children laughed freely without leaving anyone behind. Daniel opened the passenger door of his old pickup truck just as he had every morning for years. Sophie climbed inside, looked back at the school one last time, and quietly waved. Nothing about their lives had become perfect. The truck was still old. The work was still difficult. Money was still carefully budgeted. But their greatest treasure had never been found in any paycheck. It had always lived in the simple decision to answer hurt with grace, fear with love, and cruelty with quiet dignity. Sometimes the world changes because one person speaks louder than everyone else. And sometimes it changes because one father quietly shows his daughter that the strongest heart is the one that never stops choosing kindness. 1 year later, Jefferson Elementary looked almost the same from the outside. Yet the people inside carried themselves differently. Bright spring flowers lined the front walkway, children hurried toward classrooms with colorful backpacks, and teachers welcomed each student by name before the morning bell. New families moving into the district knew nothing about the difficult afternoon that had once changed the school forever. They simply noticed something unusual. Students held doors for one another. Older children naturally helped younger ones. No one sat alone in the cafeteria for very long because someone always invited them to join a table. Kindness had quietly become part of the culture. Sophie Carter had grown taller over the past year, but she still wore her favorite light blue hoodie whenever the weather turned cool. The faded backpack had finally been replaced after neighbors secretly collected enough money to buy new school supplies for several families without revealing who had donated them. Daniel Carter never learned which neighbors had organized the effort because every person involved agreed that generosity did not need recognition. When Sophie thanked her father for the new backpack, Daniel simply smiled and said, "Sometimes people give quietly because they remember what quiet kindness once gave them." Every morning before school, they continued their familiar routine. Daniel parked the old pickup truck beneath the large maple tree near the front entrance. Sophie gathered her books. They looked at one another and repeated the same promise together. Always choose kindness. Neither of them realized that someone had been watching this small tradition for months. Mrs. Foster had quietly shared the story with Principal Linda Harrison, who believed the simple ritual carried a lesson worth preserving. During the annual Student Leadership Assembly, the principal invited several older students to speak about what kind of school they wanted Jefferson Elementary to become. Before anyone else could volunteer, Sophie slowly walked toward the microphone. She paused for a moment, looking across hundreds of students seated on the gymnasium floor. Daniel had not expected to attend that morning because of work, but a last-minute schedule change at Lincoln High School allowed him to slip quietly into the back row without Sophie noticing. She took a careful breath before speaking. "Last year, I thought being different meant something was wrong with me," she said softly. "Then my dad reminded me that kindness is stronger than popularity, and truth lasts longer than rumors." The gymnasium became completely still. Sophie continued with growing confidence. "If you ever see someone standing alone, please remember that they already know they are alone. They do not need another person to prove it. They need one person to walk over and stand beside them." Several teachers exchanged emotional glances while many students quietly lowered their eyes, remembering moments when they could have done more for someone else. Sophie smiled gently before finishing. "My father always tells me that we cannot control how other people treat us, but we can always control the kind of person we decide to become." As the applause slowly filled the gymnasium, Sophie looked toward the audience and suddenly noticed Daniel standing quietly near the back wall in his familiar blue work jacket. He had arrived without telling her because he wanted to surprise her. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Daniel placed one hand over his heart and gave the smallest nod. It was the same silent gesture he had offered on the hardest days of her life. Sophie smiled through grateful tears, knowing exactly what it meant. After the assembly ended, several younger students approached Sophie to thank her for speaking. One little boy admitted he had been afraid to tell anyone he was being teased. Sophie knelt beside him and smiled kindly. "You do not have to carry it alone," she said. Daniel watched from a distance, quietly realizing that the little girl he once rushed to protect had become someone capable of protecting others with nothing more than compassion, honesty, and courage. As father and daughter walked toward the old pickup truck beneath a bright spring sky, the afternoon breeze carried the gentle rustling of maple leaves overhead. Nothing extraordinary happened on the drive home. They talked about homework, grocery shopping, and what flowers should be planted beside the front porch this year. Life felt beautifully ordinary again. Yet hidden inside that ordinary afternoon was the greatest miracle of all. A wounded heart had learned to heal without becoming bitter. A frightened child had discovered confidence without losing gentleness. And a father who had quietly shown up when his daughter needed him most had unknowingly taught an entire community that the strongest legacy any person can leave behind is not power, wealth, or recognition, but the simple decision to choose kindness every single day. 2 years quietly passed, and the story that had once filled Jefferson Elementary with painful silence slowly became something entirely different. New students arrived every fall without knowing why teachers greeted every child so personally at the front entrance, or why every classroom displayed a simple wooden sign that read, "Always choose kindness." To them, it was simply part of the school's tradition. They never realized that those 3 words had grown from the courage of one little girl and the unwavering love of one father. Daniel Carter never considered himself responsible for any of it. He still arrived at Lincoln High School before sunrise carrying the same dented toolbox, greeting every custodian, teacher, and student with the same quiet respect. He repaired broken lockers, leaking pipes, squeaky doors, and cracked classroom desks without expecting anyone to notice. At the end of every workday, he drove the same aging pickup truck to Jefferson Elementary because no matter how busy life became, picking Sophie up from school remained the most important appointment on his calendar. Sophie had grown into a confident young teenager whose kindness seemed to attract people rather than isolate her. She joined the Student Leadership Council, volunteered in the school library twice each week, and quietly welcomed every transfer student who looked nervous on their first day. She never told them about her own difficult memories unless they asked. Instead, she simply offered them the friendship she had once wished someone had offered her. One rainy afternoon, a new 6th grade student named Emma sat alone in the cafeteria, staring down at an untouched lunch tray. Several students glanced toward her before looking away, uncertain how to begin a conversation with someone they had never met. Sophie noticed immediately. Without hesitation, she carried her own lunch across the room and sat beside Emma with a warm smile. "Hi," she said gently. "Would you like some company?" Emma looked surprised before slowly nodding. By the end of lunch, they were laughing together over favorite books and family pets. Mrs. Foster watched from across the cafeteria with quiet emotion filling her eyes. After school, she found Sophie organizing library books and asked softly, "How did you know she needed someone?" Sophie smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Because I remember exactly what it feels like when everyone else keeps walking." Mrs. Foster thanked her before quietly stepping into the hallway. She later called Principal Linda Harrison and said, "The lesson we hope to teach has finally become part of who our students are." That evening, Daniel picked Sophie up beneath another gentle spring rain. The windshield wipers moved steadily back and forth while soft country music played through the truck's old speakers. Sophie looked out the passenger window for several minutes before speaking. "Dad, today I met a girl who reminded me of myself." Daniel glanced toward her with gentle curiosity. "And what did you do?" Sophie smiled. "What you would have done." Daniel laughed quietly. "Then I already know she had a better day because of you." They stopped at a small neighborhood grocery store before heading home. As they walked through the parking lot carrying paper bags filled with milk, bread, soup, and fresh apples, an elderly man approached Daniel with a thoughtful smile. "Excuse me," he said. "You probably do not remember me." Daniel apologized politely. "I am afraid I do not." The man chuckled warmly. "My grandson attends Jefferson Elementary. He came home one afternoon and told us about a father who showed everyone what real strength looked like. Ever since then, our family has started every dinner by sharing one kind thing we did for someone else that day." Daniel stood quietly, genuinely surprised. "I did not know anyone remembered." The man smiled. "Good examples have a way of traveling farther than the people who set them." After the man walked away, Sophie looked at her father with quiet admiration. "You always say kindness matters even when nobody notices." Daniel carefully placed the grocery bags into the truck before answering. "The beautiful thing is that we never really know who is noticing." As they drove home beneath clearing skies, golden sunlight broke through the clouds and stretched across the winding country road leading toward their little white house. Yellow flowers bloomed beneath the front porch where Emily had planted them years earlier, filling the yard with gentle color that returned every spring no matter how difficult the winter had been. Daniel paused for a moment before unlocking the front door. He looked at the flowers, then at Sophie standing beside him, and quietly smiled. Some promises are fulfilled all at once. Others are fulfilled one ordinary day after another, through patient love, humble choices, and hearts that refuse to let hardship become hatred. In that peaceful evening light, father and daughter stepped inside together, carrying nothing more remarkable than groceries, gratitude, and the quiet certainty that kindness, once planted, always finds a way to bloom again. 5 years passed with the quiet certainty that seasons always return, and every spring the yellow flowers beneath the front porch bloomed exactly where Emily had planted them years before. Daniel Carter still lived in the same little white house at the end of the maple-lined street, still drove the same faithful pickup truck, and still believed that the most important things in life rarely attracted attention. Sophie was no longer the frightened little girl who once clutched a faded backpack in the middle of a crowded school courtyard. She had grown into a thoughtful young woman whose confidence was matched only by her compassion. During her final year of high school, she volunteered every week with younger students across the district, quietly mentoring children who struggled to find their place. She never introduced herself by telling them what had happened years earlier. Instead, she listened first. She remembered that healing always begins when someone feels heard. One warm, May evening, Jefferson School District invited families to celebrate the graduation of student mentors who had completed hundreds of volunteer hours serving younger children. The ceremony was held in the same gymnasium where Daniel had once stood quietly in the back, hoping no one would notice him. This time the room looked brighter than ever. Sunlight poured through the high windows while rows of white chairs stretched across the polished floor. Parents smiled proudly from the audience. Teachers greeted former students with warm embraces, and children who had once needed encouragement now walked confidently across the stage. Daniel chose the last row again. He had never been comfortable standing in the spotlight. His blue work jacket had finally been replaced after years of faithful service, but his quiet smile remained exactly the same. As the ceremony continued, Principal Linda Harrison stepped to the microphone one final time. "Before we conclude," she said, "one of our graduates has asked to share a few words." Sophie walked slowly onto the stage carrying a small folded piece of paper. She looked across the audience before quietly setting the paper aside. "I thought I needed to write a speech," she said with a gentle smile. "Then I realized the most important words have lived in my heart for years." The room became completely silent. "When I was younger," she continued, "I believed being laughed at meant there was something wrong with me. I believed kindness made people weak. I believed standing alone meant nobody cared. I was wrong." Daniel lowered his eyes as memories quietly returned. Sophie looked toward the last row until she found him. "One person showed me that love does not have to shout to be heard. One person taught me that dignity is stronger than anger, truth lasts longer than rumors, and compassion changes more lives than revenge ever could. That person is my dad." Hundreds of people slowly turned toward Daniel. He looked slightly embarrassed, wishing the attention would move back to his daughter. Sophie smiled through grateful tears. "Everything good I have ever done for someone else began with a simple promise we repeated every morning before school. Always choose kindness." Those words carried me through the hardest day of my childhood, and they continue guiding every decision I make today. No one spoke. Even the youngest children sat perfectly still. Sophie stepped down from the stage and walked directly to the back row. Daniel stood before she reached him. Without saying anything, father and daughter embraced as the audience quietly rose to its feet. The applause was gentle, respectful, and filled with gratitude rather than excitement. It lasted only a short while before fading naturally into peaceful silence. Later that evening they drove home beneath a sky painted with the soft colors of sunset. The windows of the old pickup truck were rolled down, letting the warm spring air carry the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers through the cab. Neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with conversation. Some moments become complete simply by being shared. When they reached home, Daniel paused beside the yellow flowers beneath the front porch and looked toward the fading light on the horizon. Sophie slipped her hand into his just as she had done years before. "Dad," she whispered, "thank you for showing up." Daniel smiled gently. "Sweetheart, that was never a choice." The evening breeze stirred the flowers while the last rays of sunlight settled across the little white house that had witnessed every promise, every hardship, every quiet victory, and every ordinary day that slowly became extraordinary through love. In the end, the world did not remember a father because he was wealthy, famous, or powerful. It remembered him because when one frightened little girl believed she was standing alone, he simply walked toward her with kindness in his heart, dignity in his steps, and a love so steady that it quietly changed every life it touched.